September 1940. The sun set over London like any other evening. But as darkness fell, the sky began to hum with an unfamiliar sound, a deep, growing roar. It wasn't thunder, it was the Luftwaffe. For the first time in modern history, an entire civilian population was about to become a front line. Britain had stood alone since the fall of France. Hitler, unable to invade the island by sea, chose another weapon: terror from the air. The plan was simple: break Britain's spirit, destroy its cities, and force surrender. But what began as a military strategy soon became something far more personal. The war had come home. The first wave of bombers arrived just after dusk. Sirens wailed across London. Families scrambled for gas masks, mothers clutched their children, and streets emptied as the first explosions tore through the night. Firestorms erupted across the docks and railways. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and fear. But in the midst of panic, something unexpected happened. Ordinary people began to fight back, not with guns or planes, but with courage. Firefighters rushed through burning streets. Neighbors helped one another dig through rubble. Underground stations became shelters where strangers huddled together, whispering prayers as the city shook above them. The Blitz had begun. A relentless bombing campaign that would last for 57 nights without pause. London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless other cities became targets. No place was safe, no night was silent. In those first hours, it was impossible to understand what was unfolding. To many, it felt like the end of the world. But for Britain, it was only the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought not just by soldiers, but by citizens. This was no longer about defending borders or battlefields. It was about protecting homes, families, and the spirit of a nation. As London burned, Britain discovered something it didn't know it had: an unbreakable will to endure. By the second week of September 1940, the Luftwaffe had made London its main target. Each evening, as dusk settled over the River Thames, thousands looked to the horizon and saw a terrifying sight: black crosses in the sky, stretching as far as the eye could see. It wasn't just a few bombers, it was an armada. Engines thundered like distant drums. The sound alone sent chills through the streets. The first bombs fell on the East End, densely packed neighborhoods where working-class families lived shoulder to shoulder. The docks, rail lines, and factories were the official targets, but the bombs didn't care about precision. They tore through homes, schools, and markets. Within hours, entire blocks were engulfed in flames. Firefighters battled the infernos through smoke and falling debris, their silhouettes glowing red in the heat. Londoners soon learned a new vocabulary of fear: the air raid siren, the dive of the Stuka, the crash of collapsing brickwork. Each sound meant something. Each second mattered. When the siren howled, families ran for shelter: basements, cellars, and the underground tunnels that became their refuge. Children learned to sleep to the rhythm of bombs. Mothers packed emergency bundles with bread, water, and photographs, never sure if they'd return home the next morning. Night after night, the raids continued. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The British called it the Blitz. Cities across the country joined London in suffering. Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow, and Coventry all burned under the same orange glow. Yet, in the midst of chaos, life went on. Bakers opened at dawn, newspapers printed through the night, buses ran through streets lined with rubble. Even the famous red postboxes continued to collect letters, a quiet reminder that the country still functioned, still lived. Churchill refused to evacuate London. He walked through the bombed ruins with his cigar clenched between his teeth, a symbol of defiance. His words on the radio became the country's heartbeat. "We can take it." And somehow, they did. By the end of 1940, Britain had endured thousands of bombing raids, but the nation still stood. The people's courage had become its strongest defense. The enemy could destroy buildings, but not resolve. The Blitz was supposed to break Britain's back. Instead, it hardened its spirit.
As the bombs fell and the nights burned red, a strange transformation swept across Britain. The country began to change, not only in its streets, but in its soul. Ordinary people who once thought of war as something distant and military now lived it every day. The battlefield was their home, their street, their kitchen table. The government called it the People's War. Every man, woman, and child became part of the fight for survival. In the cities, the air raid precautions wardens, known simply as ARPs, patrolled rooftops and alleys, shouting, "Put that light out," during blackouts. A single uncovered bulb could guide enemy bombers. Volunteers dug trenches, cleared rubble, and carried the wounded through smoke-filled streets. Many worked through the night and went to their regular jobs the next morning, exhausted but unbroken. In nearly every home, a gas mask hung by the door, ready for use at any moment. Families practiced drills in case of chemical attacks, which many feared would follow the bombing. Children were taught to recognize the sound of planes and to move without panic. But panic was never far away. The nights seemed endless, the explosions unpredictable. The evacuation of children became one of the most emotional chapters of the war. Thousands were sent away from London and other cities to the countryside, clutching small suitcases and wearing name tags around their necks. For many, it was the first time they had ever left home. Parents stood on train platforms, waving bravely through tears, unsure if they would see their children again. The silence after each departure was heavier than any air raid. Rationing also changed daily life. Food, fuel, and clothing were scarce. Everyone carried ration books, carefully counting each ounce of sugar or tea. Yet somehow, people learned to make do. Vegetable gardens appeared in backyards and parks. "Dig for victory" became a national slogan. But what defined the home front most was its sense of unity. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now shared shelters and meals. Strangers comforted one another in underground stations where hundreds slept side by side on concrete floors. Music echoed through tunnels. Children laughed, and people sang softly to drown out the noise of bombs above. The Blitz was tearing the country apart physically, but it was also binding it together emotionally. Britain had never been more vulnerable or more united. By late 1940, the Blitz had reached its most violent phase. The raids were now more frequent, more destructive, and more coordinated. Each night seemed darker, each explosion louder. But among the countless nights of terror, two would be remembered forever: the firestorm over London, and the night Coventry was erased from the map. On the evening of December 29, 1940, London faced one of the worst air raids in history. The Luftwaffe unleashed over 100,000 incendiary bombs, small metal canisters filled with burning magnesium, designed not to explode, but to ignite. Within minutes, the ancient heart of London was engulfed in flames. The city skyline turned orange as the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral stood silhouetted against an inferno that threatened to consume everything. Firefighters battled for hours, often with little more than buckets and pumps. Water mains had burst from earlier blasts, leaving entire streets dry. The heat was so intense that shoes melted on cobblestones. One witness described it as a river of fire flowing through the streets. Journalists later called it the Second Great Fire of London. But amid the chaos, acts of quiet heroism unfolded everywhere. Fire watchers climbed rooftops to knock burning bombs off buildings with shovels. Priests refused to abandon their churches. Nurses worked through collapsing walls to rescue the wounded. When dawn finally came, much of London's financial district was gone, but St. Paul's still stood, untouched, like a symbol of defiance rising through smoke. Just weeks earlier, another city had suffered an even darker fate. Coventry, a proud industrial town, had been targeted because of its factories that built aircraft engines and munitions. On the night of November 14, 1940, over 500 German bombers dropped over 500 tons of explosives. Within hours, Coventry Cathedral was reduced to rubble. The city center glowed red for miles. Residents remembered the sound of bells replaced by the roar of collapsing buildings. Rescue crews pulled survivors from burning ruins while the Luftwaffe circled back to drop more bombs. In one night, nearly 600 people were killed, thousands injured, and an entire city was shattered. These nights changed Britain forever. They were not just moments of destruction, they were trials by fire that tested the nation's spirit. Cities were left smoking, hearts were broken, but the people did not yield. Instead, out of the ashes rose a quiet vow: we will not fall.
When the bombs stopped falling, silence wasn't peace. It was the beginning of another battle. The air still smelled of smoke and dust. Streets were buried under debris, twisted steel, and shattered glass. Fires smoldered beneath collapsed roofs. And out of that destruction came Britain's unsung heroes, the ordinary men and women who refused to give up. The first to appear were the firefighters, many of them volunteers, with little training but endless courage. They worked through nights so bright with flame that they called them Red Dawns. Carrying hoses through burning alleys, they fought not only the fires, but exhaustion, smoke, and collapsing walls. Thousands of them never made it home, their bravery remembered only in the flicker of memorial candles decades later. Beside them were the rescue workers, miners, engineers, and carpenters turned heroes overnight. They crawled through ruins, listening for the faintest cries beneath the rubble. Sometimes they dug for hours to find only silence. Other times they pulled survivors into daylight, their faces blackened with soot and tears. In London alone, over 70,000 civilians were rescued alive from destroyed buildings. Nurses and doctors turned underground stations into hospitals. Operating by candlelight, they stitched wounds and treated burns while the bombs continued to fall outside. Supplies were scarce and blood was precious, but compassion never ran out. Many medical staff refused to seek shelter, saying simply, "Our patients can't leave, so neither can we." Then there were the messengers and wardens, teenagers on bicycles who carried urgent notes through bombed streets, guiding ambulances and firefighters when phone lines were down. They dodged flames and falling debris, risking their lives to keep the city connected. Perhaps the most remarkable were the ordinary civilians who learned to carry on in a world reduced to rubble. Shopkeepers opened stalls beside craters. Barbers set up chairs on sidewalks. Mothers swept dust from doorsteps that no longer had doors. Each act, as small as it seemed, was an act of defiance, a way of saying to Hitler, "You can destroy our buildings, but not our will." Every brick lifted, every wound dressed, every cup of tea shared in the aftermath of an air raid became part of Britain's resistance. It wasn't fought with rifles or tanks, but with grit, kindness, and faith in one another. As one survivor later said, "We didn't feel brave, we just felt we had no choice." But sometimes that's what real courage is. Churchill's defiance and the spirit of the people. While bombs thundered over London, one man's voice became the nation's strongest weapon. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, understood that wars were not won only by armies but by hearts. His speeches, broadcast across the airwaves, were more than words. They were fire. His defiance gave people strength when the world around them seemed to be crumbling. From his underground war rooms, Churchill studied reports of devastation. Streets flattened, thousands homeless, families torn apart. Yet when he appeared before the public, he never spoke of despair. He spoke of courage, honor, and destiny. "We shall fight on the beaches," he had declared months earlier. But now his message was even more intimate. "We can take it." Those 4 words echoed through shelters, factories, and hospitals. They became the heartbeat of a wounded nation. Churchill's daily visits to bombed neighborhoods were more than symbolic. They were deeply human. He walked among the ruins, his coat covered in dust, shaking hands with survivors and firefighters. When someone wept, he wept with them. When someone cursed the enemy, he nodded silently. His presence told people that their suffering mattered. But Churchill's greatest victory was not in strategy, it was in spirit. He knew Britain couldn't outgun Germany at that moment, but it could outlast it. If the people refused to break, the empire would stand. And so he made every citizen a soldier in a war of endurance. Propaganda posters reinforced that message. Keep calm and carry on. Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. These were not just slogans, they were lifelines. Even humor became a weapon. Comedians cracked jokes in bomb shelters, newsreels showed Londoners smiling through the smoke, and newspapers printed cartoons mocking Hitler. Defiance became part of daily life. The more the bombs fell, the stronger the laughter grew. Still, Churchill understood the cost. In private, he admitted the air raids haunted him. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, referring to the pilots who defended Britain. But it also applied to every citizen who stood their ground. Britain's spirit was no longer in its armies or its ships. It was in its people. They were weary, grieving, and scarred, yet unshaken. Churchill had given them something the enemy could never destroy: belief.
As Britain's men went to sea, to the skies, and to the front lines, it was the women who held the country together. They became the invisible backbone of the war effort, the hands that built, healed, and carried the nation through its darkest nights. While the enemy tried to destroy Britain from the outside, women ensured it did not collapse from within. In factories once run by men, women now worked around the clock. They built aircraft, assembled munitions, repaired vehicles, and packed parachutes. Their faces were streaked with grease, their hair tied up in scarves to protect it from machines, their uniforms marked with dust and oil. The factories never slept. Each shift began with the same words pinned to the wall: "The work you do here can win or lose the war." In hospitals and first aid stations, women served as nurses, stretcher bearers, and ambulance drivers. They moved through chaos with calm precision, carrying the wounded from rubble or treating them in candlelit basements. Many were part of the Voluntary Aid Detachment or the Women's Voluntary Service, ordinary citizens who had trained themselves to face the unimaginable. And on the home front, women became the anchors of family life under siege. They managed rations, raised children alone, and kept households functioning amid shortages and fear. Mothers sewed clothes from old curtains, grew vegetables in bombed-out lots, and comforted children during sleepless nights in shelters. Every meal placed on a table was an act of quiet victory. Women also entered roles that redefined society. They joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, manning anti-aircraft guns, operating radios, decoding messages, and plotting aircraft routes on war maps.
In places like Bletchley Park, female codebreakers worked tirelessly beside mathematicians, their efforts saving countless lives without ever being publicly acknowledged. But beyond duty, there was resilience. Women found ways to laugh, to sing, to keep hope alive. They formed sewing circles in shelters, shared recipes for meals made from almost nothing, and wrote letters to soldiers reminding them that home still stood. For centuries, wars had been told as stories of men, but in this one, women were no longer supporting characters. They were the story itself. Their endurance became a weapon stronger than any gun. They did not seek glory or recognition, yet they changed what Britain was and what it would become. When the bombs stopped and peace returned, the country would never again see them as just homemakers. They had proven they could build, lead, and endure. In the ashes of war, Britain discovered its silent strength, and it had a woman's face. Every night, as the sirens wailed and the sky turned red, thousands of people hurried down staircases that led deep beneath London's streets. The underground, once a symbol of movement and modernity, became something else, entirely different. A sanctuary, a city beneath the city, and the heart of Britain's endurance. Families carried blankets, flashlights, and tin cups as they descended into the tunnels. Children clutched stuffed toys. Mothers carried babies wrapped in scarves. Soon, entire platforms were covered with makeshift beds, old mattresses, crates, and wooden planks. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of oil and sweat. The trains no longer ran at night. The tunnels belonged to the people. In those confined spaces, life continued. Volunteers organized food lines, distributed tea, and set up first aid posts. Musicians played harmonicas or violins to calm frightened children. Newspapers were read aloud, songs were sung, and laughter echoed faintly against the tiled walls. Despite the fear above, the underground became a community, a place where Londoners rediscovered one another. There were rules, of course. Each family had its spot, marked by a blanket or a name written in chalk. Arguments broke out, friendships formed, and love stories began between people who might never have met in peacetime. Babies were even born underground, their first cries mingling with the distant rumble of bombs. Outside, the destruction continued. Whole neighborhoods disappeared overnight, but the spirit below remained unshaken. People joked that they had season tickets to the safest hotel in London. Children learned to sleep through the vibrations of explosions. When the all-clear siren finally sounded each morning, the weary crowds climbed back to the surface, stepping into streets covered in ash and silence, only to do it all again that night. The underground shelters weren't luxurious. They were crowded, cold, and often unsanitary. But they were proof of the British will to survive. In the darkness, rich and poor shared the same benches. Titles, class, and privilege meant nothing underground. Every life was equal when the bombs fell. Historians would later call them the shelter generation. They grew up without fear of darkness because they had learned to find warmth in it. They learned that home wasn't just a place, it was the people beside you when the world above was burning.
By early 1941, the bombs had not broken Britain, they had hardened it. The Luftwaffe still roared over cities, but the people no longer panicked, they endured. Hitler's campaign to crush British morale had failed, and now, for the first time, the tide was beginning to turn. The Royal Air Force had grown stronger. The lessons learned from the Battle of Britain were now shaping a new strategy, the counter-blitz. Night after night, British bombers lifted off from airfields across the countryside, heading toward German cities that had once seemed untouchable. Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne all felt the echo of destruction they had once sent across the Channel. The raids were brutal and costly. Many young pilots never came home, but for those who survived, each mission carried meaning. For London, they whispered before takeoff. For Coventry. The war that had once been fought defensively had now become a fight for retribution and survival. At home, the anti-aircraft defenses grew sharper. The Royal Observer Corps tracked incoming formations, and radar stations on the coasts guided fighter squadrons with precision. The skies that had once belonged to the enemy were now contested, and the British were no longer running. The introduction of Allied cooperation also changed everything. American supplies and aircraft began pouring into Britain through the Lend-Lease program. Convoys crossed the Atlantic carrying fuel, food, and weapons, keeping the country alive. Slowly, the island fortress began to rebuild its strength, preparing for the long war ahead. By mid-1941, even Hitler began to shift his focus. His attention turned eastward, to the Soviet Union, and the relentless bombing of Britain began to ease. The nightly raids became sporadic, smaller, and less devastating. For the first time in nearly a year, the sky over London was dark not with planes, but with stars. Still, the scars of war remained visible everywhere. Streets lay in ruins, families were broken, and cities were forever changed. But what mattered most was that Britain still stood. The enemy had failed to conquer by fear. In secret war rooms and underground offices, new plans were being drawn, plans that would one day lead to the liberation of Europe. The people who had once hidden in shelters were now part of a nation preparing to strike back. The Blitz was ending, but its legacy was permanent. Courage could be louder than bombs, and unity could outlast fire. From the ashes of their cities, the British were not just surviving, they were beginning to fight back. Legacy of the home front. When the final air raids faded and the sky over Britain fell quiet, a strange silence settled across the country. Cities lay in ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, yet something deeper remained untouched: the will of the people. The Blitz had ended, but its legacy was only beginning. The war had changed Britain forever. The home front was no longer just a phrase, it had become a shared identity. For the first time in modern history, civilians were recognized as soldiers in their own right. The housewife with a bucket of sand, the nurse with blood on her hands, the boy who cycled through burning streets delivering messages, they had all fought their own battles, and in doing so, had redefined what courage meant. The destruction left scars that would take years to heal. Coventry's cathedral remained in ruins as a memorial to endurance. In London, the hollowed shells of buildings stood beside new construction, silent reminders of how close the nation had come to collapse. But from those ruins rose a new spirit, a belief that survival was not enough. Britain would rebuild stronger, fairer, and more united. The government began planning for a different kind of victory, a victory of society. Out of the war's suffering came new social reforms, better housing, education, and the foundation for the National Health Service. The people who had endured the bombs expected something better than the world they had known before. The Blitz had taught them that every life mattered equally, and that the nation could only stand if it stood together. Culturally, the Blitz became a symbol, proof that courage could exist in ordinary hearts. The image of Londoners singing in shelters, of firefighters standing against infernos, of children smiling amid rubble, all became part of Britain's collective memory. Films, poems, and radio broadcasts kept their stories alive, not to glorify suffering, but to honor resilience. Winston Churchill's words echoed long after the last bomb fell. "We shall never surrender." It wasn't just a political statement, it was a truth written into the hearts of millions. The home front had proven that victory doesn't always come from battlefields. Sometimes it comes from endurance,
from choosing to stand when the world falls apart around you. When the smoke cleared and the light returned, Britain was no longer the same country that had entered the war. It was tougher, humbler, and infinitely more human. The courage of ordinary people had become its greatest weapon and its proudest legacy.